The emergency room had exactly 4 minutes of warning before it became a battlefield, and in those 4 minutes nobody thought to check how much oxygen was left in the reserve tanks. A charter bus carrying 38 passengers had collided with a fuel truck on the interstate, and within moments the intake bay was a river of stretchers, shattered glass, and screaming. By the time Dr. Lucas Reed counted the incoming patients, the number had climbed past 20, and the number of working oxygen lines had fallen to almost nothing. Aaron Brooks was not supposed to be a patient that night. He had come to deliver a repaired ventilator valve, a small errand for a company that paid him barely enough to keep the lights on, and he was standing near the loading dock when his own lungs betrayed him. A young woman was wheeled past him, her chest barely rising, her face the color of ash, and a nurse was shouting that there was no oxygen left for her. Aaron looked down at the tank strapped to his own hip, the one that kept him alive on bad days, and without a single word of hesitation, he unclipped it and pressed it into a stranger's hands. Nobody in that hallway knew his name. Nobody turned a camera toward him. 3 days later, an empire worth tens of billions of dollars would carry the name of his daughter, though not a single person in that chaos could have predicted it. Aaron Brooks was 35 years old, a widower who had spent most of the last 3 years raising his daughter Eleanor alone in a modest apartment on the edge of town. Long before his badge read maintenance technician, he had been an engineer, one of the men who designed emergency oxygen delivery systems for hospital networks across 3 states. He understood pressure valves and backup regulators the way other men understood their own heartbeat, and there had been a time when hospital administrators asked for him by name whenever a new wing was built. An industrial accident years earlier had left permanent scarring on his lungs, a quiet injury that flared whenever he exerted himself too much, and so he carried a personal oxygen tank the way other men carried car keys, an object so routine he barely noticed it anymore. His salary now was a fraction of what he had once earned, the price of choosing steady hours over ambition so he could be home for his daughter. And though the apartment was small and the furniture secondhand, Eleanor never seemed to notice what they lacked. Mornings began the same way. A bowl of cereal pushed across the counter, a backpack checked twice for homework, a walk to the corner where the school bus stopped, and then a full day of driving between clinics and hospital basements, fixing machines that other people depended on to breathe. Rarely spoke about his late wife, and he rarely spoke about the accident that had changed his lungs forever, because in his mind, dwelling on what was lost only stole time from what still needed to be done. Neighbors in the building knew him only as the quiet man in Unit 6 who fixed things for anyone who asked, unclogging a jammed door hinge for the elderly woman down the hall, or patching a leaking pipe for a young couple who could not afford a plumber. He kept a small toolbox by the door, worn at the corners from years of use, and he took a strange comfort in repairing broken things, as though every fixed valve or restored circuit was a small way of making up for the one thing he could never repair, the sudden illness that had taken his wife 3 winters earlier. Eleanor barely remembered her mother's face, only fragments of a voice humming somewhere in the kitchen, and Aaron made certain never to let that absence become a wound she carried without support. He read to her most nights before bed, simple stories about brave animals and distant kingdoms, and he never let his own exhaustion show through the patience he offered her at the end of each long day. Colleagues at the maintenance company respected him without quite understanding him, aware only that he worked harder than anyone else on staff and asked for recognition from no one. When newer, younger engineers occasionally sought his advice on complicated oxygen delivery problems, he answered them plainly and without a hint of superiority, never mentioning that he had once designed systems far more advanced than anything the company currently serviced. Across the city, in an office built almost entirely of glass, Grace Whitmore was fighting a very different kind of exhaustion. At 34, she had become the chief executive of Whitmore Medical Group after her father's health forced him out of daily operations, and the weight of that inheritance sat on her shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. Samuel Whitmore, the founder, was quietly dying of advanced heart failure in a private wing that even senior staff did not know existed, and Grace had spent the better part of 2 years hiding that fact from investors, employees, and the press. Connor Blake, the chief operating officer, had made himself indispensable during that time, whispering in boardrooms about efficiency and margins, pushing Grace toward decisions that felt less like healthcare and more like arithmetic. Under his influence, community hospitals in poorer counties had quietly been sold off or stripped of funding, their maintenance budgets slashed in the name of consolidation, and Grace had signed off on more of those decisions than she wanted to admit to herself. She still remembered, faintly, the values her father used to speak about when she was a child, the idea that a hospital existed to save lives first and generate profit second, but those memories had grown distant under the daily grind of shareholder calls and quarterly targets. She told herself the trade-offs were temporary, that once the company stabilized she would return to the mission that had once defined it, yet every month that promise slipped further away. At night, alone in an apartment far too large for one person, Grace often replayed old memories of walking through hospital corridors as a child, holding her father's hand while he greeted nurses and janitors by name, treating every person in the building as though their work mattered as much as his own. She wondered sometimes what that version of her father would think of the decisions she now signed off on without a second thought, decisions justified by consultants who had never once set foot inside an emergency room during a crisis. Connor had a talent for making those decisions feel inevitable, framing every budget cut as a matter of survival in a competitive industry rather than a choice with consequences for real patients in real beds. Grace had learned to trust his numbers because trusting them was easier than confronting what those numbers actually represented, and easier still than admitting how far she had drifted from the woman she once imagined becoming. The afternoon of the crash began like any other for Lucas Reed, the head of the emergency department at Fairview General, until the first ambulance radio crackled with numbers no one wanted to hear. Word came in fast. A charter bus carrying dozens of passengers had struck a fuel truck near the highway overpass, and within minutes the department braced for a mass casualty event unlike anything they had processed in years. The backup oxygen system, already overdue for maintenance after years of budget cuts nobody outside the building knew about, chose that exact afternoon to fail. Alarms blared through the corridors as pressure gauges dropped to zero, and staff scrambled from room to room searching for portable tanks that no longer existed in sufficient numbers. Lucas stood in the center of the chaos barking orders, sending nurses to raid supply closets, calling neighboring hospitals for anything they could spare, and watching helplessly as patient after patient arrived with injuries that demanded immediate respiratory support. Aaron Brooks had arrived only 20 minutes earlier to drop off a repaired regulator valve, an unremarkable errand that suddenly placed him in the middle of the worst night the hospital had seen in a decade. As he stood near the loading dock watching gurneys roll past, his own chest began to tighten, an old and familiar warning that meant his damaged lungs were reaching their limit under the stress of the moment. It was in that instant, gasping quietly for air himself, that Aaron saw the young woman being wheeled in from a separate ambulance bay, her body marked by the kind of trauma that left little room for hope. She had been thrown from her seat during the collision, her ribs fractured, one lung partially collapsed, and the monitors beside her were already screaming warnings that her oxygen saturation was falling fast. A nurse pressed a mask to her face out of instinct, only to realize the line behind it carried nothing, the tank it was meant to draw from already empty. Lucas turned in every direction searching for a spare canister, his voice rising with an urgency that cut through the noise of the hallway, and for a moment no one had an answer. Aaron understood, in the way only someone who had spent years designing these very systems could understand, exactly what those falling numbers meant. He knew that within a matter of minutes, without intervention, the young woman on that gurney would not survive the night, and he knew that the only working oxygen source within reach of her was strapped to his own body. He did not shout, and he did not hesitate, because in Aaron's mind the decision was never really a decision at all. He reached down, unclipped the strap holding his personal tank in place, and stepped forward into the chaos surrounding the gurney. Lucas turned just as Aaron placed the tank directly into his hands, guiding him wordlessly toward the mask still resting uselessly against the young woman's face. For a moment, Lucas simply stared at him, stunned, before finally managing to ask what anyone would ask. He wanted to know what Aaron intended to do without it, given that anyone standing close enough could see the strain already written across his own face. Aaron only offered a faint, tired smile, the kind of smile that carried no fear in it at all, and told him simply that he could hold on a little longer than she could. Within seconds, the mask was fitted properly, the tank connected, and the monitors beside the young woman began climbing back toward numbers that meant survival. The relief in that corner of the hallway lasted only a few minutes before Aaron's own body reached its limit. His vision narrowed, his knees buckled, and he collapsed quietly against the wall while nurses nearby scrambled to catch him before he hit the floor. He was carried into a separate recovery room, unconscious for several minutes, his own oxygen levels dangerously low, while the department around him remained consumed by the emergency of the night. No one thought to ask his name in that moment, no one photographed what he had done, and no phone was raised to capture the scene for anyone beyond those four walls. There was no live stream, no post shared to strangers, no audience beyond the handful of exhausted medical staff too busy saving lives to register what they had just witnessed. Miles away, in a boardroom lit by projector screens and quarterly charts, Grace Whitmore sat through a shareholder meeting entirely unaware that a stranger had just given away his own breath inside one of her hospitals. She would not learn his name for 3 more days, and when she finally did, it would come to her not as a headline but as a single line buried inside an internal incident report. It was Lucas who first noticed something unusual once the chaos of the night had finally settled into the quieter rhythm of recovery. Reviewing patient files the following morning, he discovered that Aaron had refused every form of financial assistance offered to him during his brief admission, declining even the standard courtesy of a follow-up appointment paid for by the hospital. He had checked himself out quietly before sunrise, leaving behind only a signature and a phone number that connected to nothing more than a maintenance company's general line. Curious and still troubled by how close the department had come to catastrophe, Lucas pulled the maintenance records for the hospital's backup oxygen system, hoping to understand exactly how it had failed so completely. Buried in decade-old documentation, he found a name he did not expect, listed as the lead engineer responsible for designing the very system that had nearly cost dozens of lives the night before. The name on that faded document was Aaron Brooks, the same man who had appeared out of nowhere to save a stranger with his own tank. Digging further, Lucas discovered that the system's failure had almost nothing to do with faulty engineering, and everything to do with years of deferred maintenance. The kind that happens when budgets are trimmed by executives who never set foot in the building they are cutting. Signed authorizations for reduced maintenance contracts stretched back nearly 5 years, each one bearing the same signature belonging to Connor Blake, the man steering Whitmore Medical Group's cost-cutting strategy from behind the scenes. Lucas began to understand that the crisis of the previous night had not been an accident of fate but the predictable result of decisions made far from any hospital floor. Disturbed by what he found and unwilling to let the truth disappear into a filing cabinet, he compiled everything into a formal report and sent it directly to Grace Whitmore's office. He did not expect a response, assuming it would be filtered through layers of assistants before ever reaching her desk, but Grace happened to be the one who opened it herself late that evening. For the first time, she read the name Aaron Brooks, unaware that within 72 hours it would change the direction of everything she had built. Grace read the report 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it, each pass revealing another detail that unsettled her further. A man with no institutional ties to her company had walked into one of her failing hospitals and given away the very thing keeping himself alive, asking for nothing in return, expecting no recognition at all. She thought of the countless press releases her communications team had drafted over the years, carefully worded stories designed to make Whitmore Medical Group appear compassionate, and she felt a hollow discomfort settle in her chest. Somewhere in the building, Connor Blake was likely already calculating how this incident could be managed, spun, or buried before it reached anyone outside the walls of the hospital. Grace decided, almost without thinking, that she needed to see this man for herself, not as a public relations opportunity but as something closer to a confession she owed him. She pulled his address from the personnel files of the maintenance contractor and, against the advice of her assistant, chose to go there alone rather than send a representative in her place. The apartment complex where Aaron lived stood in stark contrast to the marble lobbies. Grace walked through every day, its hallways narrow and its paint chipped near the corners, yet it felt strangely more honest than anywhere she had been in years. She found him in a small community clinic 2 blocks away, kneeling beside an outdated oxygen concentrator, patiently coaxing it back to life for patients who could not afford anything newer. He barely looked up when she introduced herself, focused instead on tightening a valve with the same quiet concentration he must have shown the night of the crash. When Grace finally explained who she was and attempted to offer him compensation, an amount large enough to change his life entirely, Aaron shook his head before she had even finished the sentence. He told her plainly that he had not helped that young woman in order to receive anything in exchange, and that turning his actions into a transaction now would make the moment feel smaller than it had been. Grace stood there watching him work, waiting for some flicker of resentment or quiet calculation, some hint that he was simply negotiating for a better offer, but she found nothing of the sort. There was no mention of the job he had lost years earlier, no complaint about the smallness of his apartment, no attempt to leverage his story into anything resembling advantage. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace felt genuinely ashamed of the empire she had inherited, an empire that had somehow drifted so far from the principles her father once preached that it took a stranger's selflessness to expose the distance. She thought of every hospital quietly sold off under Connor's guidance, every maintenance contract trimmed to satisfy a spreadsheet rather than a patient, and she understood, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, how much had been lost along the way. Standing in that small clinic surrounded by second-hand equipment and a man who asked for nothing, Grace made a decision that would set the following weeks into motion. She would not simply thank Aaron Brooks and move on with her life as though the encounter had never happened. She intended to find out exactly how deep the rot went inside her own company, no matter what it cost her personally, and no matter who it implicated along the way. Within days, Grace launched a full internal investigation into the maintenance practices across every hospital under the Whitmore Medical Group umbrella, assigning a small team she trusted completely and bypassing Connor's usual channels of oversight. Connor, sensing the shift in tone almost immediately, attempted to intercept the inquiry by offering his own internal review instead, insisting that outside investigators would only create unnecessary panic among shareholders. Grace refused, and as her team dug deeper they uncovered a pattern far more extensive than a single failed oxygen system at one hospital. Falsified maintenance logs surfaced across multiple facilities, documents altered to suggest inspections had taken place when in fact critical equipment had gone untouched for years. Rural hospitals, the ones with the fewest resources and the least ability to advocate for themselves, had been hit hardest by the cuts, their emergency systems left in states of disrepair that bordered on criminal negligence. Expired equipment sat quietly in storage rooms across the network, never replaced despite repeated warnings from facility managers whose concerns had been dismissed or ignored entirely. Interviews conducted by Grace's investigative team revealed a pattern of quiet desperation among facility managers who had submitted request after request for updated equipment, only to watch those requests disappear into budget committees that never responded at all. One manager from a small hospital near the state border admitted, almost apologetically, that staff had grown accustomed to rationing supplies during emergencies, treating equipment shortages as an unfortunate but unavoidable part of the job rather than a failure worth reporting further up the chain. Grace read through each interview transcript personally, unwilling to let her team summarize away the details that made the failures feel abstract and distant. She began to understand that the crash which nearly took Catherine's life had not been an isolated incident, but the almost inevitable result of a system quietly rotting from years of neglect, one that had simply been fortunate enough not to fail catastrophically until that particular night. Connor, when finally confronted directly with the mounting evidence, attempted to justify each decision as a matter of necessary financial discipline, insisting that no reasonable executive could have predicted the specific chain of events that led to the crash. Grace found herself unable to accept that explanation any longer, recognizing in his words the same rationalizations she had once used to justify her own silence. While the investigation unfolded, Samuel Whitmore finally regained enough strength to sit upright in his private hospital bed, and Grace made the decision to tell him everything, no longer willing to shield him from a truth that concerned the company bearing his name. He listened without interrupting as she recounted the night of the crash, the stranger who gave away his own oxygen, and the trail of neglect that investigation after investigation continued to expose. When she finished, Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the hospital window, before he finally spoke in a voice weaker than she remembered but no less firm. He told her that the company had been built to save lives long before it was ever built to satisfy shareholders, and that if she wanted to honor what he had spent his life creating, she needed to rescue that mission before worrying about the company's public image. His words settled into Grace with the weight of something she had needed to hear for years, a permission she had not realized she was waiting for. Within a week, Connor Blake was formally suspended pending the results of the ongoing investigation, and the news sent a visible tremor through the entire board of directors. It was during a later stage of the investigation that Grace learned something that made the entire story feel even more improbable than it already was. The young woman Aaron had saved that night, the one whose oxygen levels had been climbing back towards safety just as he collapsed, was identified in hospital records as Catherine Whitmore, a name that stopped Grace mid-sentence when she first read it. Catherine, it turned out, was Grace's own cousin, a resident physician who had chosen years earlier to work under a different surname specifically to avoid the assumptions that came with the Whitmore name. She had wanted to earn her position through her own skill rather than her family's reputation, and so almost no one at the hospital knew of her connection to the company that owned it. Had she not survived that night, the loss would have devastated the entire family, and Grace understood with a chill exactly how close that possibility had come to becoming reality. Samuel, already fragile from his illness, might never have recovered from such a blow, and the ripple effects through the family and the company would have been impossible to calculate. Aaron, for his part, had never known any of this, had never asked the young woman's name, and would likely have made the same choice regardless of who she turned out to be. To him, she had simply been a patient in need, a stranger whose life mattered exactly as much as any other stranger's life would have. 3 days after the crash, Grace called an emergency press conference, and speculation across the industry ran wild about what the announcement might contain. Analysts assumed she intended to name a new chief operating officer following Connor's suspension, while others guessed she might unveil a restructuring plan meant to reassure nervous investors after weeks of unsettling headlines about the internal investigation. When Grace finally stepped up to the podium, the room fell into the kind of silence reserved for announcements nobody had properly prepared for. She spoke first about the crash, then about the failures in maintenance that had nearly cost lives, refusing to soften the truth for the sake of public relations. Then she told the room that Whitmore Medical Group, the company bearing her family's name for nearly 4 decades, would be renamed entirely, effective immediately. A murmur spread through the gathered reporters, uncertain what new corporate title might replace the one they had known for so long. The new name appeared on the screen behind her a moment later: the Eleanor Medical Foundation, named after the 7-year-old daughter of a man almost none of them had ever heard of. Grace explained, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was announcing, that a medical empire should not be remembered for the name of the person who built it, but for the reminder of why it needed to exist in the first place. She spoke of Aaron Brooks without turning his sacrifice into spectacle, describing simply what he had done and what it revealed about the distance her own company had drifted from its founding purpose. By the time she finished speaking, the entire room had risen to its feet, applause echoing through a space more accustomed to quarterly earnings reports than moments of genuine reckoning. Aaron Brooks, at that very moment, was at home helping Eleanor with a spelling assignment, entirely unaware that his daughter's name had just been placed above the entrance of one of the largest medical networks in the country. A formal invitation arrived at Aaron's apartment several days later, requesting his presence at a company event described only as a small gathering of thanks. Aaron assumed it would be a brief, forgettable ceremony, perhaps a handshake and a plaque, the kind of gesture companies offered when they wanted to close a story quietly rather than let it linger. He wore his only suit, a little worn at the cuffs, and brought Eleanor along after the school day ended, thinking the whole affair would last less than an hour. When they arrived, the room was larger than he expected, filled with employees, board members, and members of the press he had not anticipated seeing at all. Grace greeted him personally near the entrance, her expression carrying none of the polished detachment he might have expected from someone in her position. As the lights dimmed and a screen rose at the front of the room, Aaron assumed some kind of tribute video was about to play, a brief summary of the crash and his role within it. Instead, the screen displayed a single word in enormous letters above the company's new logo, and it took Aaron several seconds to understand what he was looking at. His daughter's name, Eleanor, stretched across the header of a medical foundation that operated hundreds of hospitals across the country, and for a long moment he simply stood frozen, unable to process the scale of what had happened. Grace stepped beside him and explained, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, that this was not a gift meant to reward him, but a correction meant to remind the entire organization of what it had nearly forgotten. She then extended 3 formal offers, each one carrying more weight than the last. She asked him to accept the position of Senior Advisor for Emergency Oxygen Systems, overseeing an ambitious initiative to modernize equipment across every hospital under the Foundation's care, along with control over a newly established fund dedicated specifically to maintaining medical equipment in underserved rural communities. Aaron accepted the role without hesitation, though he made clear from the very beginning that he had no interest in any personal bonus or financial reward tied to the announcement. He told Grace plainly in front of the gathered crowd that if she truly wanted to thank him for what he had done, the only acceptable form of gratitude was ensuring that no patient would ever again die simply because a hospital had run out of oxygen. Grace nodded, understanding immediately that this was not modesty for the sake of appearances, but a genuine reflection of the man standing before her. The room applauded again, softer this time, more reflective, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing something rarer than a corporate announcement. Eleanor, standing quietly beside her father through most of the ceremony, tugged gently at his sleeve and asked in a small voice why so many people kept saying her name. Aaron knelt down to her level, smiling in the way he always did when trying to explain something too large for a simple answer, and told her that sometimes people need a name to remind them what truly matters most. 1 year passed, and the transformation within the newly named Eleanor Medical Foundation reached far beyond anything the initial press conference had promised. Hundreds of hospitals across the country underwent complete overhauls of their emergency oxygen infrastructure, replacing outdated systems with modern equipment built to the same standards Aaron had once championed decades earlier. Thousands of new oxygen units were installed in facilities that had gone years without proper maintenance, particularly in rural communities that had long been the first to suffer whenever corporate budgets tightened. A dedicated support fund, seeded initially by company reserves and later expanded through new donor partnerships, ensured that underserved hospitals would never again face the kind of neglect that had nearly cost lives during the night of the crash. Reported equipment failures across the network dropped to a fraction of what they had once been, a statistic that meant far more in human terms than in financial ones. Grace herself had changed just as visibly as the company she led, trading the language of quarterly targets for a renewed focus on patient outcomes, a shift that even skeptical board members eventually came to respect. Samuel Whitmore, having witnessed the transformation firsthand from his hospital bed, retired not long after with a peace he had not expected to feel given the fragility of his health. He spent his final working months mentoring Grace privately, less concerned with strategy now than with making sure she carried forward the values he had spent his life building the company upon. Aaron, for his part, continued working exactly as he always had, moving between hospitals and clinics with the same quiet diligence that had defined him long before anyone knew his name. He never sought public attention, declining nearly every interview request that came his way, and he refused any special privileges that might have set him apart from the technicians and engineers he worked alongside every day. To most of the people who passed him in hospital hallways, he remained simply another maintenance worker, unremarkable in appearance, entirely unaware to strangers of the empire that now carried his daughter's name. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the quiet street where they lived, Aaron walked home from another long day spent inspecting oxygen lines at a hospital 2 towns over. Eleanor was waiting on the front steps as she always was, and the moment she spotted him rounding the corner, she ran to meet him, wrapping her arms around his waist the way she had every day since she was old enough to walk. As they climbed the steps together, she looked up at him with the curious expression she often wore when something had been sitting unanswered in her mind for a while. She asked him, in the plain and honest way only a child could manage, why so many people at the hospital kept saying her name whenever they saw her father. Aaron paused at the door, considering how best to answer a question far larger than her small voice suggested she understood, before finally kneeling down to meet her eyes directly. He told her that people said her name because they wanted to remember something important, something easy to forget in a world full of buildings, machines, and balance sheets. He explained, as gently as he could, that the most valuable thing in medicine was never the towering hospital wings or the newest equipment lining their hallways, no matter how impressive they appeared from the outside. What mattered most, he told her, was a person willing to give away even their own breath if it meant saving someone else's life. A truth far simpler and far more enduring than anything measured in dollars or square footage. Eleanor considered this for a moment with the seriousness only children bring to conversations they do not yet fully understand, then simply nodded and pulled him inside for dinner, the conversation already fading into the background of an ordinary evening. Aaron closed the door behind them, the noise of the empire bearing his daughter's name feeling distant and unimportant compared to the small, warm kitchen where the two of them sat down together. He had never wanted recognition, had never sought out a legacy, and yet somehow his quiet decision on the worst night of the year had rewritten the purpose of an entire institution. It was, in the end, never about the size of the empire he had unknowingly reshaped, but about the simple, unshakable belief that had guided him his entire life, that no stranger's life was worth less than his own comfort, and no act of true kindness ever required an audience to matter. Genuine kindness never needs a witness to be real, and the smallest, most invisible act can quietly reshape an entire system built around it. The true value of medicine has never rested in its buildings or its balance sheets, but in the willingness of one person to protect the life of another without hesitation. Reputation can be purchased with enough money and enough clever marketing, but trust of the kind Aaron Brooks earned that night can only ever be built through sacrifice, and it can never be manufactured any other way.